Hey guys, Paul here from familywheels.ca with another car review for your growing family. And this week on the program, we're in beautiful Banff National Park for a bit of a hiking weekend away, and we're doing it in the 2017 Kia Sportage, redesigned for 2017. This is the fourth generation of this vehicle, which has been in Kia's lineup since the mid-90s at this point, believe it or not. And the previous generation of the Sportage hadn't seen a redesign since 2010, so certainly time to have a bit of a reboot for this vehicle. It's a bit longer, it's a bit wider. It's meant to kind of look like a bit of a fighter jet, in fact, according to Kia, and I think that it's borrowed some style cues from the Porsche Macan, the Range Rover Evoque, certainly much more expensive versions of smaller SUVs or crossovers that are out there. It also now has an available 2-liter turbocharged engine on board, which for a vehicle of this size makes it very eager indeed. But let's hop in, see how it drives, put it through some of our standardized tests, and we'll give you our Family Wheels review. That's all coming up. You know, I look at the size of these bags. So when a vehicle has been relatively unchanged for a number of years in a company's lineup, sometimes change does ruffle some feathers. The previous edition of the Sportage did look a little bit more off-road capable in my mind. This does look kind of like a bit more of a beefed up car than an SUV or off-roader, but you can't deny the fact that it does have a fair bit more room on the interior, more shoulder room, more leg room, more headroom. So for me as a 6'2" tall driver, I'm doing just fine back here. In fact, the second row seating does have a little bit more room as well, but we'll see what that does for second row comfort coming up here in a little bit. So there are a ton of different trims and options to wade through with this new Sportage, but basically you can break that down into 3 categories: the EX, the LX, and the SX. And you can get into a basic front-wheel drive EX for just shy of $25,000. Now, most Canadians are going to want to have all-wheel drive because most of us are going to be facing snow at some point or another in a given year, and if you want that, it's going to add an extra couple $1,000s. You get into an all-wheel drive EX for about $27,000. But some of the base kit on that EX is actually pretty impressive. Things like fog lamps up front. You've got heated seats up front as well in the front 2 passenger seats. You've got Bluetooth connectivity so that you can have hands-free conversations right here on the steering wheel. You've got a 5-inch infotainment system screen, which includes a rear backup camera, which is a very clear, high-resolution camera, by the way. And you do have the ability to use Android Auto, so you can mirror what is on your Android phone, flash it up on the screen, and all of a sudden you have navigation on that base trim, and you don't have to spend thousands extra to get navigation if you just want a basic car otherwise. Now, most trims of the Sportage are going to have a 2.4-liter naturally aspirated non-turbo engine on board, which apparently has plenty of pep. I haven't had an opportunity to drive it, but it does give you 181 horsepower. If you want to have the extra oomph of this 2-liter turbocharged engine, you need to bounce your way up to this SX trim that I'm in here today. It's a fair bit more expensive at just shy of $40,000, but there's not much in here that I'm really missing. We have leather seating surfaces. We have a leather-wrapped steering wheel, sport-inspired shape for the steering wheel as well, which is heated, by the way, for cold winter days. And then we don't just have heated seats up front in the SX trim, you also have heated seats in the back. And then for really hot days, the front seats have ventilated seats where cold air blows up and keeps you a little bit cooler. Also included in this SX trim, we have keyless entry, we have push-button start, the side mirrors fold in for when you get into a really tight parking spot. We have this charging station, which no longer requires you to plug your phone in. You can just throw it onto this pad and it will automatically start charging. The infotainment system is upgraded to an 8-inch system and also includes Kia's in-house navigation system. And we also have this massive panorama sunroof, which basically runs the full length of the Sportage's roofline. Lets a lot of extra light in here and makes it feel quite airy in the cabin. Also in this SX trim, we have some pretty decent safety features, including this blind spot detection system, but the visibility in this car is much improved for 2017, where the previous generation had fairly small windows on board. The blind spots and visibility in this car way better, but we do have blind spot detection. We also have lane keeping assist systems, where the vehicle recognizes the lines that have been painted on the road and will sound an alarm if you drift from those lines. Here, let me show you. There it goes. turbos. But unlike, say, Toyota and Honda, which have the same system on board, but also will kind of steer you back into the center of the lane just with some slight nudging of the steering wheel, this is just an alarm that sounds here on the Sportage. We also have rear cross traffic alert, so as you're backing out of a parking spot and someone comes zipping up behind you, an alarm's going to sound and warn you that someone's coming. And then emergency braking systems too, where if you're not reacting quickly enough to slowing traffic up ahead, that the car will actually take over and brake for you a little bit. So all of those systems, which were also available on the previous generation of the Sportage, that give this car a top Safety Pick Plus rating from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. A pretty safe vehicle here. But for me, the big difference here in the SX trim has to be this 2-liter turbocharged engine. It's a lot of fun to drive around, especially when you compare it to a car that a lot of people are going to cross-shop with the Sportage, and that's the Hyundai Tucson and the 1.6-liter turbo that's available to you in that car. That engine, I found last year when I was driving it around for you, very laggy. The turbo took a few seconds to spool up off the line, and it was really bothersome. We don't have that issue here in the Sportage. And the nice thing about this engine too is that I'm seeing some pretty decent fuel economy numbers. Kia is saying that you should see between 10.2 to 11.9 liters per 100 kilometers as your average, but I'm doing way better than that here this week with 500 kilometers on this car, a mix of city driving and highway driving. I've averaged 8.8 liters per 100 kilometers, which, given the fact that this is a fairly sporty feeling vehicle, pretty darn good. You've got a 6-speed automatic transmission in this vehicle regardless of the trim or engine that you go for, and you have paddle shifters here on this SX trim, which is kind of fun, but it does make some weird shifting choices on really steep hills. I've been thrown into 4th gear and the engine is almost redlining, and I have to shift over into Tiptronic mode for me to manually shift it into a higher gear so that I can actually get rolling a little bit faster. It maxes out in 4th gear at about 90 kilometers an hour. As soon as I shift it into 5th or 6th gear, I can get myself back up to highway speed. So I'm glad that we have these paddle shifters here on this SX trim, not just for playing around in corners, but also for a situation like that. By the way, speaking of cornering in this car, it is pretty darn smooth and flat considering the fact that you're in an SUV. The downside to that is the fact that when you're on a rutted or potholed road, it's going to be a bit of a rougher ride. So if that's in your day-to-day commute, you've got rougher roads or say a really rough alley that you have to drive through, maybe consider taking one for a test drive first to make sure that it's actually going to work for you. Another thing that I was a little bit disappointed with this car, even though Kia is saying that they put work into making it a quieter ride, it's still on the noisier end of our decibel reader test. So with our decibel reader out at 100 kilometers an hour on a flat section of highway, we hit 66 decibels, which compared to that Ford F-150 I was out in last week, you'd think that truck would be a lot louder. In fact, that vehicle reached 55 decibels, a much quieter ride. This is definitely a bit of a noisy vehicle to drive around in. Now, while those turbocharged engines in the Tucson and the Sportage might have very different personalities, once you step inside, you're going to find a lot of the same technology on board, and that's because Hyundai and Kia are actually owned by the same parent ownership group. So some of the things that I liked and disliked about the interior on the Tucson, I'm seeing here in the Sportage as well. Very comfortable seats in this vehicle. They're fantastic. Some nice soft touch surfaces throughout. However, I don't like this high gloss piano black plastic. I think it's going to look cheap and dated over time, and some of the switchware just kind of feels a little bit cheap in your hand. So you can get a lot of features for $40,000 in this car, but it doesn't always feel, when you actually run your hands over it, particularly high end. So we're back in the city, back at home, and I've moved to the second row for you to show you what it's like back here for a full-size adult. And you can see that at 6'2", I'm pretty close to maxed out in headroom, although it is still okay for me, but it's the legroom which is pretty tight. So I've adjusted the driver's seat for a tall driver as well, and you can see that, yeah, I'm pretty maxed out here. In fact, I really wouldn't want to go for much more than a quick ride around the block. But if you've got a shorter driver with preteen kids in the back, legroom in this Sportage is going to be a total non-issue for you. Now, other things that I like about this car, well, they include this kick plate, this plastic kick plate, so that if you've got kids constantly kicking the back of these seats. They're not going to get scuffed up too badly. This leather is very comfortable and feels very durable as well, like it's going to be able to put up with a fair bit of abuse. And the second row seating is also quite comfortable. Although here's my big issue. I've talked about this countless times, and it seems like pretty much any car that has leather seats these days has these perforations. And yes, sure, they make sense in the front row if you have ventilated seats, but beyond that, especially in the back row, recipe for real hard cleanups, because these pores are going to clean up or fill up with so much stuff. Bit of a challenge to keep clean. Also in the back seat here, we've got a USB charging point as well as a traditional cigarette lighter charge point, which is a handy feature to have. And in the higher level trims, as I was mentioning, you've got heated seats available to you as well in the second row. Now let's take a look at the trunk space in this Sportage. Again, higher level trims on this car are going to have an automatic lift gate, and there it goes. If you don't use the auto lift gate, it feels really forced, so you're going to have to pretty much use that function full time if you've got that. But you can see here that with our standardized trunk test, not too bad. Mind the blustery weather. We've got our standard amount of gear, a couple bags of groceries, a diaper bag, a backpack, filled up stroller, and a soccer ball. And yeah, we can fit all this with room to spare. The Tucson does have slightly more trunk space at 877 liters, whereas this has a 798 liter trunk, but a pretty close comparison in terms of what you can fit. And nice to see that the stroller can also fit lengthwise, because that's often a challenge. If it has to fit sideways, it's gobbling up way more trunk space. And then finally, our rear-facing car seat test, which is now in place. And you can see what this has done to legroom up front. It actually looks worse than it is. And the number doesn't sound great either compared to a lot of the other tests we've done at 9 inches of legroom up front. But because this glove box slopes off nicely away from the shin, I can actually fit in here pretty comfortably at 6'2". Check out my legroom. Not as bad as I was expecting. And headroom up here, again, still pretty darn good for a small crossover vehicle of this size. So that was a pleasant surprise here in this Sportage. So after more than 20 years on the market, Kia continues to reimagine this Sportage with a new edition that's more aggressive looking and more feature filled than ever. The looks aren't going to be for everyone, but they have grown on me over the last week driving it around. And you can't argue with the fact that for $40,000, this top level trim packs in a ton of features. So many features, in fact, that you wouldn't see this kind of kit in a lot of vehicles twice its price. Another thing that really separates the Korean brands is the 5-year, 100,000 kilometer warranty. That really helps put people's minds at ease. But, and I'm really hoping that this isn't the case, we may have a warranty issue on our hands here in this tester, because this transmission continues to get worse in the week of driving. In fact, even here in the city now, I'm having problems with it shifting, well, late shifting. It's redlining almost all the way up to the red line in second and third gear, and I'm having to use the manual Shiftronic function or the paddle shifters just to make sure that I'm in an actual proper gear in this car. And hopefully that's not a sign of larger issues to come with the transmission in the Sportage for 2017. I'd love to know what your thoughts are though on this car. Which way would you lean compared to, say, the Tucson? Which car would you prefer to buy? And if you looked at all these different trims in the Sportage, which way are you leaning on that front as well? You can leave a comment below. You can always find me on Twitter as well, at Family Wheels. And make sure to check out our website too, familywheels.ca, for a full report card that we have there on the Sportage. Next week on the program, we're in the new Mazda CX-9. We'll see how that largest SUV in the company's lineup is looking for this year. Until then, have a great week, and we'll see you in about 7 days.